Welcome in Human Nature Explained. Today I will go with the second video of Russell Ackoff. So as a reminder, I already went through the first part and I made notes. The most interesting part was the distinction between machine age that was coined during Renaissance and machine age is based on analysis, that is deconstructing objects into parts, understanding each part as a separate entity, and then understanding the whole by aggregating everything into parts. And there were problems with this approach that were overcome by system thinking and system age, actually, where additionally to analysis, that is this approach, we can also do the opposite approach, where synthesis, where we first identify a whole of which the system you are trying to explain is a part, explain the behavior of the containing whole, disaggregate the whole to understand parts. So this is the end of what was discussed in the first video. Also the system, what is the system, was discussed. Now let's go through the second video. Let's start with the explanation of the second
vegetable never seen before. Most of you, and I asked you if you'd ever seen a fruit or vegetable you'd never seen before. Most of you have. Now suppose you have a visitor in your home, comes from some exotic country, to this country for the first time, and walks into your dining room where you have a bowl of fruit, and he points to an object in that bowl and he says, what's that? And you look at him in utter amazement and you say, that's an orange. He said, I've never seen one of those before. What do you use it for? You say, it's a fruit. We eat it. He says, what's it like? You say, wait a minute, I'll show you. So you go in the kitchen and get a knife and come back and slice the orange and open it up and show it to him. Now what he sees, when you show him the orange, is a circle with a white seam down the middle and two segments on either side, right? Now, just about that time, your roommate, spouse, or whoever else occupies your facility with you, enters the room and characteristically says, what are you doing? And you explain that your visitor has never seen an orange before, so you're trying to show him what it is. And characteristically, your spouse or roommate says, why don't you slice it the other way? Now, your typical response is, what the hell difference does it make? But then if you stop and reflect for a moment, you might say, hey, that's a good idea. So you get the knife again, and you either put the orange back together again and slice it the other way, or take a fresh one. And you slice it the other way, and what you now see is something that looks like this. Now those two are exactly the same object, but they're two entirely different views of it. Now, what Singer observed is we have been assuming that the universe could only be sliced one way, cause and effect. He said, in fact, there are an infinite number of ways of slicing it. Producer product is another way. But there are many others as well. Now, if you really want to know what the structure of an orange is.
So going back to the discussion here, he talks that there are many ways of understanding universe. Inspecting universe and now understanding, let's have it this way. One way is cause and effect. Another is producer and consumer. Consumer, okay.
How many ways ought you to slice it? Well, every conceivable one. So he devoted his life to slicing it the other way to see what would happen. All right, now remember, a producer is necessary, but not sufficient for the effect. A mother is the producer of a child, not the cause of a child. because despite women's lips, she's only necessary, not sufficient. The same is equally true of a father. All right. What happens to the first thing, environment free? We want to explain that oak. We look back in history and we can identify the acorn from which that oak grew. Do we have a complete explanation of the oak? No. Why? Because the acorn was not sufficient. To get a complete explanation, we have to know all the other necessary conditions, which together with the acorn is the cause of the oak. Now, what are the other necessary conditions? The environment. Lo and behold, you now need the environment to explain everything. You can't explain anything without the environment. Furthermore, there's no such thing as a universal law.
You can't explain anything without environment.
Laws are always relevant to a particular environment, and there's always some other environment in which they won't hold. This has been one of the great shocks that's been occurring in science in the last couple of decades. For example, as a child, I was taught that the most immutable law of nature is that everything that goes up must come down, right? Well, how? We're putting things up all the time that don't come down anymore. Occasionally one of them does, it's not supposed to, but in general, we know how to get things up there that won't come down. In fact, we even raised the question about what up and down means. Everything becomes environmentally relevant. We develop whole new concepts of experimentation, the result of the work of R.A. Fisher in England, in which we don't do experiments in the laboratory anymore in systemic work. It's done in the real world with multiple variables and the environment taken into account, not excluded, but brought in. But that's a whole topic that we don't have time to explore in any detail here. So we get an environment-full theory of explanation. First cause, we saw what happened to that. We get a different concept of God. God as a whole, rather than God as a part from the universe and its creator. And what happened to determinism? Well, that's the most complex part of Singer's work, but what he demonstrated is that when the world is looked at from the point of view of producer product, choice and free will is completely compatible with it, and furthermore, can be objectively studied, just like the weight and speed and other physical characteristics of a person. And that doctrine is called teleology, or purposefulness. Now, if you take teleology together with environment full, with producer product, expansionism, and put it all together, what's the view of the universe that begins to emerge? No longer that of a machine, but the universe is seen as a system, but a particular kind of a system, a purposeful system. We see things now as systems, and systems have parts. And every system is contained in a larger system. Because remember, we can't prove that there's one system that contains everything, because if there is, we'll never find it. Now, these are sometimes referred to as the superos system. In common English, that's the environment. The system and the subsystem. Now, the two important things that emerge in starting to look at things this way. First of all, there are three kinds of systems. There's a system which has no purpose, a purposeless system. They exist. And if the system has no choice, its parts can't have. You can't have a system which doesn't have choice, whose parts do. What do you call such a system? A system that has no choice. That's what a machine is. That's precisely what a machine is. It's a purposeless machine, a purposeless system. A machine serves the purposes of a containing system. The automobile has no purpose of its own.
Interesting. Let's write this. 3 types of systems. Purposeless system, machine, has no purpose. It's no purpose.
Oh, but it serves your purposes. You are its containing system. It's an instrument of a purposeful system.
It's an instrument of a purposeful system.
You see, in the machine age, our problem was we saw the universe as a machine, and then we tried to explain purposeful parts, and it couldn't be done. You can't have parts that have choice of a system that has none. But now things are reversed. We see the larger system is having choice, and therefore the parts can. But if a system has no choice, it is an instrument of a system that does. So the machine is an instrument of a purposeful system. Its parts have no purpose. Now, suppose I move up one notch. I give the system a purpose, but its parts don't have any. What kind of a system have I got now? That's no longer a machine. You are such a system. You have purpose, but none of your parts do. Your heart does not have a purpose in its own. Your lungs, your stomach, your pancreas, and so on.
Okay, so it was the distinction. Purposeless system has no purpose. Can be. Its parts has no purpose. No purpose. It's an instrument of purposeful system. System that has system of purpose, but it's their parts. Its parts don't have purpose.
They serve your purpose, but they have no purpose of their own. They have no choice. You do. What do we call such a system? Organism. That's an organism.
Organism, okay.
So does it.
Organism, let's do it this way. Machine. Yes.
Second level of the system's organism, the first is the machine. I can see what the third level of the system will be. The system which has a purpose, whose parts have purpose, and which is part of a larger system that has purpose itself. What do you call that kind of system? Organization. Second level. The name is
System that has purpose and its parts also have purpose and it's a part of bigger system that have a purpose. And it's a part of a system that also has some purpose.
It's such a system. It has purposes, parts have purposes, it's part of a society that has purposes of its own. Now, it's the recognition of the extreme importance of organization as the ultimate form of system, of which all other systems are parts, not reversed. Before, an organization was a part of a machine. Now a machine is a part of an organization. That completely new concepts and insights have been obtained. Second, organization. We have always known that an organization which has a purpose of its own, that organizations are affected by their environment. That's not a surprise.
So, like there are those three types of definitions. We provide the definition that organism, that is one example is humans, is a system that have purpose, but its parts don't have purpose. I could argue that in case of human, each parts like brain, like lungs, they have its own purpose. Like to fill organism oxygen or pump the blood. So yeah, there is some kind of vagueness in these definitions, but yeah, this is maybe not that important. Having those definitions in place is the most important, most interesting thing.
But it's only in the last couple of decades that we become aware of the fact that the way an environment affects an organization, the way an environment affects an organization depends on the way the organization affects the environment. That this is a feedback loop.
Feedback loop, yeah.
As a result, we become conscious of a whole new class of problems. You see, this system out here, society has purposes of its own, and it contains other systems which have purposes of their own. Now, what we've begun to see is systems out here objecting to the effect which organizations are having on them. Organized to obstruct and protest about what effect this is having on that. And forcing organizations to take into account the purposes of organizations external to them. That has come to be called the environmentalization problem. There are two major manifestations of that in the world today.
Environmentization problem. Problem. Once again, what he means by this?
Take into account the purposes of organizations external to obstruct and protest.
Once again, with a slower pace, because I don't get it.
Here, objecting to the effect which organizations are having on them. Organized to obstruct and protest about what effect this is having on that. And forcing organizations to take into account the purposes of organizations external to them. That has come to be called the environmentalization problem. There are two major manifestations of that in the world today, environmentalization. The ecology movement is precisely such a movement, and the consumerist movement. They are both environmentalist problems. Why? They are problems which arise from pressure brought on organizations by organizations external to them, who believe they have a right to force this organization to serve their purposes more effectively. Why? Because the social system is seen as an instrument of the larger system of which it's a part, and also an instrument of its parts. Whereas in an organism, the parts are seen as instruments of the system, and the environment as an instrument of the system. You have a complete reversal. Here, the organization is an instrument of the whole of which it's a part, and its parts, they are not instruments of it. Now, the major problem which has emerged since World War II has arisen because of the following. We've always known that the behavior of the parts of a system affects the behavior of the whole. Okay?
Parts of the system affect the whole, yes?
That's what a system is. But it's only recently that we've become aware that the way the parts affect the whole depends on how the whole affects the part. And what we've begun to witness increasingly are parts of systems organizing within the system to protest about the way the system affects their purposes. This is probably the most prevalent and serious problem in the world today. It's called the humanization problem. Look at its manifestations. The third world problem is the humanization problem. These are parts of a system called the world. They say we are being messed up by the whole system, the world. And we want to change the world so our purposes are better served. The race problem, women's liberation, the generation gap, the alienation from work. All of these are manifestations of the same problem. The demand by the parts of purposeful systems that the systems of which they are a part better serve their purposes. Therefore, we have come to reconceptualize, to review what the responsibility of a system is. The management of a system, which was previously considered to be nothing but the direction of a system towards the attainment of its objectives. The management of a system.
Humanization problem. The problem where the whole affect parts, the problem in organizations, where the whole affect parts of the system, and these parts purpose is not satisfied because of the influence of the whole. The whole. This is how I understand this problem. An environmentalizational problem. I don't get this part. Maybe I need to review this part. Yes, so I call this community and my project Human Nature Explained project because I want to understand and collect the knowledge about humans. So having this humans system explained very well, but also that is organism system explained very well, but also organization, also structures that humans create also explained. So those two things I want to better explore by collecting the whole knowledge that is available in different books, but not very well gathered, at least to my understanding right now. So bigger systems that will need to be defined, organizational systems. So smaller groups of people, bigger groups of people like companies, like political parties, or even bigger groups like the whole world or nations, countries. These systems, the work of those systems is based in a big way on how the organism, that is humans, operate, they work. So having understanding how the part is works is important in order to understand how the whole organization works, for sure. But also what he says, this humanization problem, the way how those organizations are working affects how particular organism, particular humanism are working too. And this coupling, this humanization problem, how he called it, is very interesting part of a very interesting subject to explore. In the book I read recently by Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers, he's talking about the phenomena of coupling, that what people do, how people behave, is strictly coupled with the environment. So exactly this thing, he talks about this thing. That one of the most interesting examples he provides is about committing suicides. So people commit suicide if there is certain method of suicide available to them, and there was example of the poet in England, Piaf, I think was her surname, that committed suicide using carbon monoxide, because there was some gas in 60s, specific gas used that allowed to certain type of suicide to be done, and she committed suicide thanks to this. However, in the next decades, this method was no longer available to people because of the change of the gas that was used to warm houses, and because of that, the rate of suicides greatly decreased. So this shows the importance of coupling. That yes, as I said, I want to explore in a big detail. Let's go further with the recording, with the video.
Which was previously considered to be nothing but the direction of a system towards the attainment of its objectives. It is now seen as the direction of the system so as to enable a larger systems of which it is a part to attain their objective, and to enable their parts to obtain their objectives. And this is a complete conversion of the concept of management, the implications of which we're going to explore later in the day. So we see management today as dealing with three classes of purpose. Purposes of the containing all society, purposes of the system. In your case, this is the United States at the top, then the Navy, and then the individual member of the naval organization. And management has to deal with all three. Has to deal with the interaction of it. And even perhaps more critical is the fact that there are not compatible purposes within each level. That is, all the parts do not want the same thing. Not all parts of society want the same thing. So you have conflict between the three levels of purpose and within each level of purpose. And no wonder management begins to hold its head and say, my God, what in the world is happening in the world? Now being subjected to the pressures that it never was before. How come? And that's part of the problem we're going to deal with here today. So my fault, piece one. Let me take a little time now and give you a chance to have anything I've said. I guess I would like you to use the microphone so it gets on record. If it's too hard for you to get to it, just speak up and I'll repeat your question.
Let me write this because it's very important. So the problem that we have is that we need to satisfy purposes of systems and its subsystems. Systems. So then, for example, the purpose of society, the organizations, internal organizations, and particular people. The problem, let me do this. We need to satisfy purposes. The problem is that these purposes, goals, can be conflicting. So helping with one goal leads to deteriorating satisfying the purpose of the goals of the purposes of subsystems, and this is the whole issue, the whole problem.
Think of anything you have a question about? Sorry to leave. All right, if you don't, then although it's 2 minutes early, can we take a break now? Is the stuff out there? It's not. Not to 45. Okay, well, we'll start the next piece. What I want to do with you now is take a look at this organization, this third level of system, and see how our concept of it has undergone a transformation. Now, I'm going to use as an example the corporation for the enterprise, the business enterprise, rather than the military unit. I must apologize for doing this, but I've been working with corporations for all my life, and although I've done work in the military, I've never done it to the degree that I have in the corporation. The translation, I think, is fairly clear. So I'm going to deal with what I know about and ask your collaboration to help make the translation to the context you're most familiar. I will try to suggest some of that as we go along. Do you have any idea when the Industrial Revolution began in the United States? Well, yes. No. Began in England, was that big? Didn't begin in this country a little over 100 years ago. How come? Why are we 100 years after Europe? Well, Europe had been settled for centuries. They weren't doing any exploring and extending their frontiers. We were settling the land and making it suitable for agriculture. We were converting the wilderness into an agriculturally based economy. In 1900, 93% of all the people employed in the United States were employed on farms or farm industry. We were an agricultural nation. We didn't begin to industrialize until the 1970s. So it's roughly 1875, if you want to date, we began to industrialize. Up until that time, industrial activity or business activity in the United States was incredibly small. 80% of the businesses in the United States employed less than 20 people in 1875. The average space of a business activity was about the size of a two-car garage. So we were completely non-industrialized nation 100 years ago. We began to industrialize. Individuals and their families began to create businesses. And it was only a short time later that people began to recognize the need to train people to run a business. And so in 1881, the first business school in the world was created. It was created in the United States. It was created by a black man. His name was Joseph Warren. And the school he created is now known as the Wharton School. When the first business school was created, they had to develop a concept of what a business is. Okay? So the first essential question, what is a business? Well, it's not surprising when an answer was given, because the business is a part of the world. What's the world? In 1875, what's the answer? A machine, right? Then what's a business? It's just a small machine. An enterprise is a machine. Not only is a business seen as a machine, but it's a machine that's seen and been created by its God to do his work. Exactly. Now, who's the God? The owner. What was his work? Why did he create the business? To provide him with a return of profit. Therefore, the machine, the business, had no purpose of its own. It was an instrument for the generation of profit to the benefit of the owner. But the owner was God, and he literally was. He was not constrained in any way by laws or regulations. He could employ when he wanted to, when he wanted to, for as long as he wanted to, whatever requirement he wanted to, and pay whatever he wanted. In his business, he was God, unconstrained. He was present and powerful. Now, why in the world would people agree to work under those conditions? Well, there are plenty of reasons. The first one is that we were living in a time where there's no such thing as social welfare. And if you didn't work, you were at a very high risk of dying of destitution and poverty. You can see this today in the third world. You go to India. Don't ever make a mistake getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and driving around Calcutta, because there are trucks going around the city picking up dead bodies that have accumulated overnight. There'll be 2,000 to 5,000 every morning, destitute people, with no means to support. Well, this country was in that condition at that time, but quite as poor, the same thing prevailed. Therefore, if your survival depends on your work, you'll work under any conditions. That was one. Secondly, the worker in the United States is not a highly educated person. Most of them were immigrants, and the average educational attainment was 3 years. They were just barely literate, so they didn't have a very high level of aspiration. They developed high aspirations for their children, but not for themselves. They saw themselves as sacrificing themselves for the welfare of the next generation. So they were willing to work in a demeaning context. There was an oversupply of labor, because we began to mechanize agriculture, cutting back on the number of people required. And therefore, if you didn't want to work, that was no bother to the boss. You could find 100 people on the street, and he literally could pick them up. Why? Because the work was unskilled, crude labor. No fancy machinery was required. Anybody could learn it very easily and very quickly. Well, there we were, in a world in which the factory simply became a machine, and the worker became a replaceable machine part. You used the worker until he was used up or defective, and then simply replaced him with another. You had no obligation to the worker except compensation. In fact, the image that was used, if you read the literature at the time, is the worker is a slot machine, a working slot machine. You put 1 quarter in, you get 1 unit. Put 2 quarters in, you get 2 units. 3 quarters, you get 3 units. Slot machine concept. The only relevant variable in the output of the machine part was compensation. That was the worker, the bosses. But so we developed a completely mechanistic concept. There's some beautiful quotations from the period. One expression is still alive today. That was Frank Thomas: "Worker is nothing but a cog in the corporate machine." And that was liberal, in the sense that that's exactly the way he was thought. Now, this view of the organization prevailed up until about the time of World War I. In the period of the early 20s, a number of changes had begun to occur in society, which made that view of the corporation untenable, of the company untenable. The first and most critical one was this: the American economy actually boomed. The growth that was possible was phenomenal. But a problem arose. If a company took all of the capital which it generated, all its profits, and reinvested it in the company, it still couldn't grow as rapidly as was possible. The amount of growth that was possible exceeded the amount of growth that could be financed by the reinvestment of profit. Therefore, all these companies that wanted to grow were confronted with a problem. The problem was this: do I share the ownership in order to get more capital to invest, to make greater growth possible? Or do I retain control? For example, this is exactly the problem with Henry Ford. It was a small company with a few people. He perceived the growth of the automotive industry was virtually unlimited, but he couldn't finance it. What do you do? Well, what most of them did was they went public. They became public organizations. At that point, a number of transformations occur. What? God disappears. You can't sit down and worship and destroy 250,000 gods. For sure. They're the owners out there. They're not impersonal. They're abstract. They're a spirit. They're not a presence that are there powerfully anymore. What we had happen in the early 20s in industry was exactly what happened in Western culture 1985 years ago, when God disappeared, became an abstract spirit. The simple problem is, how the devil do you communicate? Well, how do we solve the problem 1985 years ago? Communication with God. We created a social function, didn't we? And an institution to enable us to do so. What do we call it? Church. And we created a profession called the clergy. And they were a gifted profession because they, through revelation, knew the will of God and could convey it to us ordinary worlds. And we could use them as an intermediary to communicate to God. Exactly the same thing happened in corporate. A clergy was created, which knew the will of the owners by revelation. Same way, communicated it to the workers, and presumably did it the other way around too. The clergy, of course, is what? Management. Management, as we understand today, emerged after World War I. When James Burnham, a professor at New York University in the 1920s, wrote a book describing this process called The Managerial Revolution, he was fired because of the radical nature of his assertion. He said, business is no longer controlled by the owners. Ownership has become an abstraction. It's controlled by managers who disguise their control under the skirts of a mythical force called the owner. So God disappears. Now some other things begin to happen. The corporations were making so much money that the tax receipts of the government were far in excess of what they anticipated. The government suddenly found itself with a treasury that was far larger than what it required. Now I had a choice. Could either reduce taxes, earn money back, or could find somebody to use it. Now I hardly got to confront you with the question, what did it decide? So it looked for good things to do. The first thing it decided is that education is a good thing. It's during this period that compulsory public education began and became the largest single form of social expenditure. By the period immediately following World War I, the average educational attainment worker had risen to 8 years. You go to school 8 years, you're a much better educated worker. However, much more complicated machinery was in there and greater skill was required. And therefore, it wasn't as easy to get rid of a worker because you had to train as a replacement. A great deal of knowledge was in there. So he's no longer looked at as a replaceable machine part, but as a vital organ. And the company began to be looked at as an organism, not a machine. We can give it a name to reflect that. It came to be called a corporation. Corporation is a word derived from a Latin word, what? Corpus, right, which means a body. And legally, the corporation became an individual, an organism. Exactly the same thing. Now, an organism does not have profit as its purpose. Profit is to an organism what oxygen is to an organism. An organism. Exactly the same thing.
This is interesting.
Now, an organism does not have profit as its purpose. Profit is to an organism what oxygen is to an organism.
Profit is to an organism what oxygen is to organism. Necessary condition.
Profit is to an organization what oxygen is to an organism. Peter Drucker pointed this out. It's necessary for existence, but not the reason for it. It's the air that you breathe. You don't live to breathe, you breathe to live. Then what is the purpose of an organism?
Survive, I guess. Oh, right, this. Because it's systems. So first of all, he talked about how businesses were treated before the Industrial Revolution. Before World War First, yes, were treated as machines. That is systems that has no purpose. Only the owner of the business has a profit purpose and he using machine to achieve it. Therefore, there's no obligation to the business, and people work for it, which is like clock in a machine. People are clocks in the machine. They can be replaced. Clocks in the machine, and they can be replaced. They can be replaced. After World War First, these turned from machines to organisms. And I think he mentioned also into organisms because the owner had to share owner with other people. After that, business turned from organizations to organizations, because people who work there are sophisticated enough so they are difficult to replace. So they are no longer like clocks in the machine. They are just educated enough to be indispensable in the business. Sophisticated, I guess. I think that's interesting. There was also this part that's profits. No, not the purpose of the organism. Actually, I'm not sure about this part. I will mark it here because I think this is not what he mentioned. It's maybe my understanding of what he mentioned. Profit is not the purpose of the organism. It's just a necessary condition for it, like oxygen.
Well, the first purpose of every organism is what? Survival, right? It has its own purpose, which is to survive. And in order to survive, you must grow. Because contraction is a process of death. Growth is the process of life.
The purpose of organism, the purpose of organism, that is business, is survival and growth. Grow equal to decay and death.
So growth becomes the primary concentration of organizations during this period following World War I. Now, at the same time, these educated workers are...
Okay, so I actually, this is not correct. Ownership. This people who worked there were sophisticated enough so they are difficult to replace. Okay, that's the situation after World War First. What will be later?
Beginning to raise concern and hell about the conditions in which they're being forced to work. They're getting to know that they don't have to work 66 hours a week under sweatshop conditions. And the men don't want their wives and children being exploited the way they were. They want a cleaner environment. When they begin to be looked at as an organism, then their health and safety become critical. And so we have the beginnings of legislation directed at improving the working conditions in order to preserve the health of the worker. And the worker himself began to organize, to bring pressure on management to be concerned with health and safety. And he organized what we today know as unions. The primary purpose of unions when they were created was the establishment of working conditions that did not reduce the length of life of the people who were employed. That was their primary objective at the time. One other thing happened. Part of the money the government was accumulating that was not used in education began to be used for the beginnings of what we today recognize as Social Security. The threat of economic destitution began to disappear. Not the threat of poverty, but the threat of extinction because of lack of employment began to disappear. So all these things contributed to a revision in the concept of a corporation. It's reflected in the language. It's absolutely beautiful. What do we begin to call the senior officer of a corporation, or of a Navy or an Army or anything? Then to be called the what of the organization? The head. Biological analogy, straight through. One of the critical books on management that was written is called The Brain and Firm. What are they referring to? Management is the brain. They talk about the communication system or the nervous system of the firm, even the metabolic system, the bringing in of materials, the production of waste, putting out of final products. The biological analogy was used absolutely throughout. In the book, The Brain of the Firm, there's an analysis of the structure of the brain, which shows that it has 5 levels of control. And then says it's exactly the way an organization should be structured in 5 levels, no more, no less. Each level should correspond to a level of the brain. So an organization, it should be nothing but a large brain. That's the organismic point of view. Okay, now what began to happen to that? World War II began. This increasingly educated and economically secure workforce was to a very large extent drafted into military service or volunteer at precisely a time that the highest demand for productivity that had ever been placed was placed on American industry. How did it go? Well, we all know. We had songs about it. We got Rosie the Riveter and Tilly the Toiler, and young people into the plants and old people out of retirement. They used everybody they could to get into the plant, to turn out the weapons and the support and protect material that were required for the waging of the war. Now, one curious thing about the military in World War II was it paid very, very little to those who were in the service. When I was inducted in 1942, my salary was $21 a month. We didn't need much more than that. But our families were well taken care of, our dependents. The system was set up so that dependents were reasonably well taken care of. They didn't have to live in abject poverty because the person on whom they depended had been pulled into the military. Therefore, those who went to work in World War II did not go to work primarily to increase income. They went out of a sense of patriotic duty. Now, when you want to get people who are working for a societal cause to work harder and more effectively, you cannot treat them as replaceable machine parts, nor can you treat them as purposeless organs. We discovered something new about the worker. He and she was a human being, and we had to begin to treat them as though they had purposes of their own. And this began to lead to a transformation. The average worker after World War II had 12 years of education, and none of them had gone to college. The skills required had elevated with the increasing sophistication of mechanization and the beginnings, the introduction of automation, a subject that I want to come to in a little bit. And as a result of these movements, the emergence of the humanization problem that I just spoke about, the alienation from work, from managers who tried to continue to treat workers as though they were organisms or machine parts became critical. The Department of Labor in the United States put out a book as recently as about 10, 12 years ago called Work in America. It said that the most important single problem confronting this country was the unproductivity of labor deriving out of the alienation from work. People didn't like what they were doing, therefore were not trying to do it well. And the reason for this is they didn't like what the nature of work was and the way they were treated at work. And this has led to a major revolution in the relationship between management and the employee that manifests itself in the third conversion, which is to begin to think of the enterprise not as an organism, but as an organization whose primary obligations are to its parts in the larger system of which it's part. I'm going to show you how that comes about, but I want to just take one moment to make one final point around this law. Remember, when the corporation was seen as a machine, it had no purpose of itself, but its purpose was to provide its owner with profit. Right? When it became to be looked at as an organism, profit was seen as oxygen. It's necessary for the existence, but not the reason for it. The organism had its own purposes. Maybe it wanted to live, and life meant growth. Now what happens when it begins to be looked at as an organization? Well, the same thing. Remember, when we went from machine to organism, profit became a means, and growth and survival became the end. Well, what happens here is growth and survival now become means to another end. And what's the end? The appropriate end for an organization, equipping an organization, is not growth, but development. This is a concept which has gotten new meaning in recent times, very recent times. We're going to have to spend some time talking about it, because most people think that growth and development are the same thing, and they're not. They're absolutely different things. They're unrelated. You can grow without developing and develop without growing. A cemetery grows, but it doesn't develop. Trash grows, but it doesn't develop. Einstein and Dirty were developing at age 80, but they weren't growing. So we have to get straight about the meaning of development. It is central to the effective management of any organization, corporate, military, governmental, or whatnot. Because it's in the difference between development and growth that we have the very core of the organizational revolution that's going to take place. Now it's about time for the break. Let's say.
Very interesting.
One of the two concepts.
Very interesting. I will go through those topics in the next video. Let me just quickly summarize this. So, after or during World War II, people in the companies were started to be treated employees. Started to be treated as humans, so we can start to treat businesses as organizations. Where these were parts of the system. People have its own goals. The last thing that Russell Ackoff mentioned, when we treat this good business as organization, then the purpose of the organization is development. Something different than growth. But I don't know right now what is the difference between these two. What I found also interesting here is what he mentioned about that during World War II, they noticed that people were doing things not for money, not for profit, but they were doing because of something bigger, patriotic things. And this is to some extent aligned with the the book that I read recently by Simon Sinek, Start with Why. Why this concept is so important. So where people see the purpose of something bigger that they can work with, they are more motivated to do the work. So they are much more efficient. That's a very interesting concept we found here during this discussion. So in this video, second part, the most interesting part was the distinction of the purposes, having machine organization, humanization problem, but also how this corresponds to having business and how the structure of businesses change over time due to several factors, most particularly world wars. So they were catalyst. World wars were catalyst of the progress and the change. Thanks for today and see you in the next video.